Ruby Calder stood in the doorway of St. Mary's Church, wearing a wedding dress that no longer fit, mourning a husband the town had already forgotten. The whispers started before she even crossed the threshold, cruel, cutting observations about her size, her audacity, her grief. When she placed a single calla lily on the memorial altar, the laughter erupted like a wound splitting open. She ran into the snow, certain she'd never deserve love again. But outside, a quiet rancher named Grant Lawson offered her something she thought she'd lost forever: dignity. This is the story of how one woman rebuilt her life from the ashes of humiliation, how a broken family became whole, and how love proved stronger than shame. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Ruby's story travels. Now, let's begin where everything changed. The February wind cut through Montana like a blade, but Ruby Calder barely felt it. She stood at the edge of the churchyard, staring at the announcement board outside St. Mary's. Memorial service for the departed. All welcome. Her fingers clutched the yellowed satin of her wedding dress, the fabric straining across her middle, the zipper held together with safety pins hidden beneath a borrowed shawl. 3 years. 3 years since Thomas had died, and not a single soul in Cedar Ridge had acknowledged it. Not a card, not a visit, nothing but averted eyes at the general store and conversations that died when she walked past. Ruby had learned to make herself small, smaller than her body would ever allow, slipping through alleys, shopping at dawn when the streets were empty, living on the charity of a church that pitied her but never truly saw her. Today, she was done being invisible. The dress had been beautiful once. Ivory satin with pearl buttons down the back, a sweetheart neckline that had made Thomas's eyes shine when she walked down the aisle of this very church 11 years ago. Now it was a relic, a ghost of a girl who'd believed she was worthy of love. Ruby had pulled it from the trunk that morning, her hands shaking as she'd forced her body into its unforgiving seams. It didn't fit. Of course it didn't fit. Nothing in her life fit anymore. But Thomas deserved to be remembered, and if wearing this dress, if making a spectacle of herself was what it took, then so be it. Ruby climbed the church steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the late morning silence. Through the stained glass windows, she could see the crowd gathered inside, their Sunday best clothes dark and somber against the pale winter light. She recognized most of them. Margaret Finch, the banker's wife who'd once called her a poor dear within earshot. Reverend Michaels, who'd stopped making house calls after Thomas passed. Victor Hale, the man whose lies had destroyed what little reputation she had left. Her stomach twisted. Victor shouldn't even be here. He'd never known Thomas, had never cared about anyone but himself. But there he sat in the third pew, his silver hair gleaming, his posture perfect, his presence a reminder of every mistake Ruby had made in her desperation to survive. She pushed open the heavy wooden door. The hinges creaked, and every head in the church turned. Ruby felt their eyes like physical weight, judging, measuring, finding her lacking. She heard the whisper before she'd taken 3 steps down the aisle. Is she wearing a wedding dress? Dear God, look at her. That dress can barely... Who does she think she is? Ruby kept walking. Her shoes, scuffed brown boots that clashed horribly with the satin, echoed on the stone floor. The calla lily in her hand trembled, its white petals pure against her reddened fingers. She'd picked it from the hothouse behind the church that morning, one of the few flowers brave enough to bloom in February. Thomas had always loved calla lilies. Reverend Michaels stood at the pulpit, his mouth slightly open, his prepared remarks forgotten. The memorial service was meant to be a general blessing for all the departed of the parish, not a personal tribute. Ruby knew that. She also knew that Thomas would be overlooked, as he'd been overlooked in life, a quiet blacksmith who'd married the wrong woman and paid for it with social exile. Mrs. Calder, the Reverend said carefully, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. We weren't expecting My husband died 3 years ago today, Ruby said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm here to remember him. The whispers grew louder. Ruby didn't look at their faces, but she felt their judgment like heat from a fire. She walked to the front of the church, where a simple altar had been arranged with candles and a wooden cross. With shaking hands, she placed the calla lily among the flickering lights. Thomas Calder was a good man, she said quietly, though her voice carried in the acoustics of the old church. He was kind. He was gentle. He loved this town, even when this town forgot him. This is highly irregular, Reverend Michaels began. He deserved better than to die alone and be forgotten, Ruby continued, her throat tight. He deserved better than me. The last words came out as a whisper. Ruby closed her eyes, touching the cool wood of the altar rail. Behind her, the whispers had shifted from shock to something crueler. Shameless. Attention-seeking. Look at her, bursting out of that dress like a sausage casing. The comparison came from Margaret Finch, loud enough for half the church to hear, and it was followed by a ripple of laughter, mean, petty laughter that cut deeper than any blade. Ruby's eyes flew open. The humiliation crashed over her in waves, hot and suffocating. She'd known this would be hard, but she hadn't anticipated the laughter, the pity she could bear, the judgment she'd learned to live with. But the laughter, raw and mocking, stripped away the last of her defenses. She turned and ran. Her boots slipped on the stone floor, and she nearly fell, catching herself on the edge of a pew. More laughter followed her, mixed with gasps and the rustle of fabric as people shifted to watch her flight. Ruby didn't look back. She shoved through the door and stumbled into the cold, the February wind hitting her like a slap. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes that melted on her heated skin. Ruby ran blindly, her wedding dress tangling around her legs, the shawl slipping from her shoulders. Behind her, she heard the church door open again, heard voices calling after her, some concerned, most merely curious. She ran faster, past the churchyard gate, past the row of bare elms that lined the property, toward the small grove of pines at the edge of the grounds. When she finally stopped, she was gasping, her lungs burning with cold air and humiliation. She collapsed against a pine tree, the rough bark catching on the delicate satin, and pressed her hands to her face. The tears came hot and fast, years of suppressed grief and shame pouring out in wrenching sobs. Stupid. She'd been so stupid to think she could do this, to think anyone would care that Thomas had died alone while she'd been too poor to pay for a doctor, too broken to do anything but hold his hand and pray. He'd slipped away in the night, and she'd woken at dawn to find him cold beside her, his face peaceful but his body already stiffening. She'd walked to town in the snow to fetch the undertaker, and when she'd returned, the neighbors had already boarded up the smithy. No one had come to the burial, not one person, just Ruby and the gravedigger and a wind that howled through the cemetery like the voice of God himself, condemning her. "Ma'am!" Ruby gasped and spun around. A man stood a few feet away, half hidden by the falling snow. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark wool coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. In his hand, he held a folded white handkerchief. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to startle you. You dropped your shawl." He held out the borrowed shawl with his other hand, the gray wool dusted with snow. Ruby stared at him, her breath hitching. She didn't recognize him, which meant he wasn't from Cedar Ridge proper. Probably a rancher from one of the outlying properties, come to town for the Sunday service. "Thank you," she managed, her voice raw. She reached for the shawl, but her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. The man stepped closer and draped it carefully over her shoulders, his movement slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. "Here," he said, offering the handkerchief. "It's clean." Ruby took it without thinking, pressing the soft cotton to her eyes. It smelled like pine and leather, and something else. Wood smoke, maybe. Or sage. She couldn't stop crying, even though she desperately wanted to. This stranger was being kind to her, and it hurt almost as much as the laughter had. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." "You have nothing to apologize for." His voice was low and calm, with a rough edge that suggested a lifetime of speaking to horses and cattle rather than people. Ruby lowered the handkerchief and looked at him properly for the first time. He had a weathered face, the kind carved by years of sun and wind, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. Those eyes were gray-blue, the color of a winter sky, and they looked at her with something she hadn't seen in so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Respect, not pity, not judgment, just simple human respect, as if she were a person worthy of it. That was brave, the man said. What you did in there. Your husband deserved to be remembered. It was stupid, Ruby whispered. I humiliated myself. Again. You honored someone you loved. There's no shame in that. Ruby shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. You don't understand. You don't know what they say about me, what I am. I know what I saw, the man said firmly. A woman with the courage to stand alone in front of people who've forgotten how to be decent. That's not nothing, ma'am. Ruby pressed the handkerchief to her mouth, stifling a sob. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken to her with such straightforward kindness. The simple humanity of it cracked something open inside her chest, something that had been locked tight for 3 years. I should go, she said, though she had no idea where she would go. Back to the tiny room she rented above the seamstress shop? Back to the silence and the memories and the slow, grinding poverty that had become her life? Wait, the man said. He hesitated, then removed his hat, revealing dark hair threaded with gray. I'm Grant Lawson. I have a ranch about 8 miles east of here, Cedar Hollow. I lost my wife 2 years ago. I understand what it's like to grieve someone the world's moved on from. Ruby looked at him, surprise cutting through her misery. Grant Lawson. She'd heard the name, a reclusive rancher who rarely came to town, who kept to himself and his land. People said he'd become a hermit after his wife died, that he lived alone in a big house with only ghosts for company. I'm sorry for your loss, Ruby said automatically. Grant nodded, his expression distant. It's been hard, especially for my daughter. Sadie's only 6, and she barely remembers her mother. I've been trying to give her a good life, but he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. A ranch is no place for a little girl without a woman's touch. I've hired housekeepers, but they don't last. Too isolated, they say. Too quiet. Ruby wasn't sure why he was telling her this, but something in his tone made her listen. She could hear the loneliness beneath the words, the same hollow ache she carried every day. I need help, Grant said simply. Not just with the house, with Sadie. She needs someone kind, someone who knows what loss feels like and can help her carry it. I saw you in that church, ma'am, and I saw someone who's been beaten down but hasn't broken. That's the kind of strength my daughter needs. Ruby's heart began to pound. Are you offering me a job? Room, board, and fair wages, Grant said. You'd have your own room in the main house, meals with the family, Sundays off, if you want them. I won't lie to you, it's hard work, and the winters are brutal. But you'd have a place. A real place, not just a room someone's letting you rent out of pity. The word struck Ruby like a physical blow. How did he know about the room? How did he know she was living on charity, counting pennies and skipping meals to make rent? She looked at him more closely, seeing the careful way he met her eyes, the steadiness in his posture. This wasn't pity. This was a business proposition, offered with dignity. Why me? She whispered. You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. I know enough, Grant said. I know you loved your husband. I know you're brave enough to face down a church full of judgment. And I know you need a fresh start as much as my daughter needs someone to care about her. He paused, then added quietly, I also know what people say about you. I don't care. I don't believe in gossip, and I don't believe the worst about people until they give me reason to. All I'm asking is that you give us a chance. Give yourself a chance. Ruby stared at him, her mind spinning. This had to be a trap. Men didn't offer jobs to women like her without expecting something in return. Victor Hale had taught her that lesson well enough. He'd offered help, too. Back when Thomas first died, and the price had been her reputation and her dignity. But Grant Lawson wasn't Victor Hale. He wasn't looking at her the way Victor had looked at her, with that predatory gleam that made her skin crawl. He was looking at her like she was a person, someone capable of contributing something valuable. I don't know, Ruby said, her voice breaking. I don't know if I can. I'm not good at anything. I burn food. I break dishes. I'm clumsy and She gestured helplessly at herself, at the wedding dress straining over her body. I'm not what anyone wants. You're what my daughter needs, Grant said quietly, and maybe what you need is to stop believing what cruel people have told you about yourself. Before Ruby could respond, a small voice called out from the direction of the church. "Papa! Papa! Where are you?" Grant turned, his expression softening in a way that transformed his stern face. "Over here, sweetheart." A little girl appeared through the snow, her red coat bright against the white landscape. She had dark curls that escaped from beneath her knitted cap and wide blue eyes that were so much like her father's they made Ruby's chest ache. The girl ran to Grant, her small boots kicking up snow, and he caught her in his arms, lifting her easily. "Papa, the service is over and everyone's leaving, and Mrs. Finch said you went running after the crazy lady in the wedding dress." The girl stopped abruptly as her gaze landed on Ruby. Her eyes went wide. "Oh." Ruby felt her face burn with fresh shame. Of course this child had heard Margaret Finch's cruel assessment. She pulled the shawl tighter around herself, wishing she could disappear into the snow. "Sadie," Grant said firmly, "that's no way to talk about a lady. This is Mrs. Calder, and you're going to apologize for being rude." "But I wasn't," Sadie began, then caught her father's expression. She squirmed in his arms until he set her down. Then she walked solemnly to Ruby, her small face serious. "I'm sorry for being rude, Mrs. Calder. I didn't mean to repeat what Mrs. Finch said. Papa says Mrs. Finch is a gossip, and I shouldn't listen to her anyway." Despite everything, Ruby felt a small smile tug at her lips. "It's all right. Mrs. Finch isn't wrong. I do look rather ridiculous." "No, you don't," Sadie said with sudden vehemence. "You look beautiful, like a princess in a fairy tale. The dress is pretty, even if it doesn't fit quite right. And you have sad eyes, like Papa does sometimes, which means you've lost someone you love. That's not ridiculous. That's just sad." Ruby's breath caught. The simple, innocent observation from this 6-year-old child cut through every defense she'd built. She knelt down in the snow, not caring that the wet cold soaked through the thin satin, and looked directly at Sadie. "You're right," she said softly. "I did lose someone I loved, and it makes me very sad sometimes." Sadie nodded gravely. "Papa says it's okay to be sad. He says Mama would want us to remember her, but not be so sad we forget to be happy too. Is that what you're trying to do? Remember but still be happy?" "I'm trying," Ruby whispered. "It's very hard." "Maybe you could come live with us," Sadie said with the straightforward logic of childhood. "Then Papa wouldn't be so lonely, and I'd have someone to talk to about being sad, and you could wear pretty dresses that fit better, and we could all remember together, and maybe be happy too sometimes." Ruby looked up at Grant, who was watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. He met her eyes and shrugged slightly, as if to say, "Out of the mouths of babes." "Your father just offered me a job," Ruby said to Sadie, her voice unsteady. "But I'm not sure I'm the right person. I'm not very good at housework, and I don't know much about taking care of children." "Can you read?" Sadie asked. "Yes." "Can you make soup?" "Sometimes, when I don't burn it." "Can you give hugs?" Ruby felt tears prick her eyes again. "Yes," she whispered. "I can do that." "Then you're perfect," Sadie declared. She reached out and took Ruby's hand, her small fingers warm despite the cold. "Please come. I promise I'll help you not burn things, and Papa's really good at fixing stuff you break. And we have lots of books, and I'll teach you how to take care of me because I'm very easy. Papa says so." Grant made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I said you were headstrong, sweetheart, not easy." "Same thing," Sadie said confidently. She tugged on Ruby's hand. "Please, pretty please? I've been wishing for a friend, and Papa says sometimes prayers get answered in strange ways, and maybe you're my strange answer. That's not an insult," she added quickly. "Strange can be good, like finding pretty rocks or seeing a deer up close or having snow on your birthday. Strange things are the best things." Ruby looked at this little girl, this confident, articulate, heartbreakingly sincere child, and felt something shift inside her. Sadie needed someone. Grant needed someone. And God knew Ruby needed something, anything other than the slow decay of her current existence. "I don't want charity," she heard herself say. "If I do this, it's a real job. I'll work hard, even if I'm not very good at first. I'll earn my keep." "You'll earn more than your keep," Grant said quietly. "You'll give my daughter what I can't, someone who understands what she's going through. That's worth more than any wage I could pay." Ruby took a shaky breath. This was insane. She was standing in the snow in a wedding dress that didn't fit, holding hands with a child she'd just met, considering a job offer from a man who was practically a stranger. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was a mistake, that she'd be hurt again, that she should protect herself. But the rational part of her brain had kept her locked in a tiny room for 3 years, slowly suffocating under the weight of other people's judgments. Maybe it was time to stop being rational. "When would you need me to start?" she asked. Grant's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes warmed. "Today, if you're willing. We'll stop by your lodgings, collect your things, and head out to Cedar Hollow before the snow gets worse. You can have a few days to settle in, meet the ranch hands, get your bearings. No pressure. If you decide it's not for you, I'll pay for the week and drive you back to town myself." "Today," Ruby repeated faintly. It felt too fast, too sudden, but then again, what did she have to wait for? Another memorial service where no one came? Another week of whispers and averted eyes? "Yes!" Sadie jumped up and down, still holding Ruby's hand. "We're going to have so much fun. I can show you my room and my books and the chickens. We have chickens, and I named them all, and there's one called Mrs. Fuzzy Bottom, who's very rude, but also very funny. And Papa's teaching me to ride, and maybe you could learn too, and—" "Sadie," Grant said gently, "let Mrs. Calder breathe." "Sorry." Sadie didn't look sorry at all. She beamed up at Ruby. "I'm just really excited. I've been wishing for someone nice to come live with us for so long, and here you are like magic." "Not magic," Ruby said softly. "Just chance." "Papa says chance is just God's way of staying anonymous," Sadie said seriously. "So it's basically the same thing." Ruby found herself smiling, actually smiling, for the first time in months. This strange, wonderful little girl, with her earnest wisdom and complete lack of guile, was like a beam of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Maybe Grant was right. Maybe this was what they all needed. "All right," Ruby said, the words coming out stronger than she expected. "Let's do this. Let's go to Cedar Hollow." But Sadie let out a whoop of joy and threw her arms around Ruby's waist, hugging her with the fierce enthusiasm of childhood. Ruby froze for a moment, then slowly wrapped her arms around the little girl, feeling the warmth of her small body through the thin wedding dress. When was the last time someone had hugged her? Really hugged her? Not just a perfunctory church embrace, but a genuine expression of affection? She couldn't remember. Grant stepped forward and carefully draped his coat over Ruby's shoulders. It was heavy and warm, still carrying his body heat. "You'll freeze before we get to the wagon," he said. "We'll get you proper winter clothes once we're home." Home. The word sent a shiver through Ruby that had nothing to do with the cold. She hadn't had a real home since Thomas died. Just a room, just a space she paid for but never belonged to. They walked back toward the church, Sadie chattering between them about all the things Ruby would need to know about Cedar Hollow. The memorial service was over and most of the congregation had dispersed, but a few people lingered near the entrance, including Victor Hale. He straightened when he saw Ruby approaching with Grant and Sadie, his handsome face arranging itself into an expression of concern. "Ruby, my dear, I was worried about you. That was quite a dramatic exit." Ruby stiffened, but Grant's hand came to rest lightly at the small of her back, a gesture of support, not possession. She found her voice. "I'm fine, Mr. Hale." "Are you?" Victor's gaze flicked to Grant, assessment in his eyes. "I don't believe I know this gentleman." "Grant Lawson," Grant said, his voice perfectly polite and completely cold. "Mrs. Calder is coming to work for me." "Work?" Victor's eyebrows rose. "Ruby, surely you don't need to. If you're in financial difficulty, I've told you before, I'd be more than happy to." "I have a job, Mr. Hale," Ruby said firmly. "Thank you for your concern, but it's no longer needed." She saw the flash of anger in Victor's eyes before he masked it with another smile. "I see. Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find me. A woman in your position shouldn't have to resort to manual labor." The implication was clear, and Ruby felt Grant tense beside her. Before either of them could respond, Sadie piped up. "Mrs. Calder isn't doing manual labor. She's coming to be my friend and help Papa and live in our house, and it's going to be wonderful. And you're being rude to her, which Papa says is never okay, even if grown-ups do it all the time." Victor's smile froze. Grant coughed to cover what might have been a laugh. Ruby looked down at Sadie, who gazed back up at her with complete innocence and absolute defiance. "Indeed," Victor said stiffly. "Well, good day, Ruby. Mr. Lawson, child." He turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid. Ruby watched him go, feeling a weight lift from her chest. For 3 years, Victor had held power over her, the power of her desperation, her isolation, her need for any scrap of human connection. She'd let him back into her life after Thomas died, had believed his promises of help and companionship, and had paid for it when he'd told the whole town she was available for the right price. But today, with Grant's steady presence beside her and Sadie's small hand in hers, Victor's power evaporated like morning frost. "That man," Grant said quietly as they walked toward a sturdy wagon hitched near the church gate, "will not be welcome at Cedar Hollow. If he bothers you, you tell me immediately. Understood?" Ruby nodded, not trusting her voice. Grant helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hands careful and respectful, then lifted Sadie to sit between them. As he took up the reins and clucked to the horses, Ruby realized she was still wearing his coat over her wedding dress, still clutching his handkerchief in her hand. "I'll return these," she said, "once I have my things." "Keep the handkerchief," Grant said. "Consider it a welcome gift." They rode through town in silence, Ruby directing them to the seamstress shop where she rented her tiny room. Mrs. Patterson, the seamstress, came to the door when Grant knocked, her eyes widening at the sight of Ruby in her wedding dress and his coat. "I'm leaving," Ruby said simply. "I found a position. I'll gather my things." Mrs. Patterson's mouth opened and closed. But your rent is paid through the end of the month." "Keep it," Ruby said. "Thank you for your kindness." It took her less than 10 minutes to pack. Everything she owned fit into a single carpet bag and a small trunk that had been Thomas's. 2 worn dresses, some underthings, her hairbrush, her husband's pocket watch, and the family Bible. That was it. The sum total of Ruby Calder's existence. Grant carried the trunk down the narrow stairs without comment, loading it into the wagon while Ruby changed out of the wedding dress and into her brown day dress, the one that was patched at the elbows but at least fit properly. She folded the wedding dress carefully, wrapping it in the shawl she'd borrowed, and tucked it into the trunk. She might never wear it again, but she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. As they left Cedar Ridge, heading east into the vast snow-covered landscape, Ruby looked back only once. The town that had been her prison for 3 years grew smaller behind them, its church spire piercing the gray sky like an accusation. But ahead was open country, white and clean and full of possibility. Sadie fell asleep against Ruby's side somewhere around mile 4, her head heavy on Ruby's arm, her breathing soft and even. Ruby adjusted Grant's coat around the sleeping child, feeling the trust implicit in such innocent sleep. "She likes you," Grant said quietly, his eyes on the road ahead. "She doesn't know me yet." "She knows enough. Children have good instincts about people." Ruby looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the strong profile, the weathered hands steady on the reins, the quiet competence in his every movement. He was probably 10 years older than her, somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of face that would never be called handsome, but carried a dignity that superficial beauty could never match. "Why did you really offer me this job?" she asked. "The truth." Grant was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady clop of hooves on packed snow. Finally, he spoke. 2 years ago, when Elizabeth, my wife, was dying, I brought her to town to see the doctor. By then, everyone knew it was consumption and there was nothing to be done. We went to church that last Sunday she was strong enough to walk. Do you know what happened? People moved away from us. They acted like death was contagious, like their fear mattered more than her dignity. His jaw tightened. Reverend Michaels gave a sermon about accepting God's will, and the whole time Elizabeth sat there knowing everyone was looking at her like she was already a corpse. We never went back. Ruby's throat tightened. I'm sorry. When she died, people sent flowers and casseroles and sympathy cards, but not one of them had been willing to sit beside her in church. Not one had treated her like she was still a person worthy of respect. He glanced at Ruby. Today, I saw you walk into that church wearing a dress that didn't fit, knowing what people would say, And you did it anyway because your husband deserved to be remembered. That took more courage than anything I've seen in this town in 2 years." "It was foolish," Ruby whispered. "It was brave," Grant corrected. "There's a difference. Foolish is doing something stupid for no good reason. Brave is doing something hard because it matters." He paused. "Sadie's going to need that kind of bravery as she grows up. She's going to need to see that it's possible to keep going even when the world is cruel. I can't teach her that. I just hide out here on my ranch and avoid people. But you could teach her that." Ruby didn't know what to say. She looked down at Sadie's sleeping face, so peaceful and trusting, and felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been frozen solid for 3 years. Maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe this was exactly what she needed. Not rescue, not pity, but a purpose. A reason to keep getting up in the morning. A chance to matter to someone. The snow had stopped by the time they reached Cedar Hollow, and the sun broke through the clouds, turning the landscape into a dazzle of white and gold. The ranch spread out before them. A sturdy 2-story house with a wide porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, and corrals where horses moved like shadows against the snow. It was beautiful. Remote and harsh, yes, but beautiful in its stark simplicity. "Home," Grant said simply, guiding the horses up the long drive. Ruby looked at the house, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the warm light glowing in the windows, at the place where she would try to rebuild her life, and allowed herself something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The first thing Ruby noticed when she stepped into the house at Cedar Hollow was the silence. Not the oppressive, lonely silence of her rented room above the seamstress shop, but a different kind, vast and waiting, like a held breath. The entry hall was spacious, with dark wood floors that gleamed in the afternoon light, and walls painted a soft cream. A staircase curved upward to the second floor, its banister smooth and polished. Everything was clean, almost austere in its order, but it felt empty somehow, like a house waiting to remember how to be a home. "Let me show you around," Grant said, setting her trunk down by the door. Sadie had woken as they pulled up to the house and now bounced on her toes, eager to begin the grand tour. "This is the parlor," Sadie announced, dragging Ruby by the hand into a room on the right. "We don't use it much because Papa says it's too fancy for every day, but sometimes I read in here when it's sunny because the windows are big and the light is nice." The parlor was indeed formal, with 2 upholstered chairs flanking a stone fireplace and a small sofa that looked like it had never been sat on. A piano stood in the corner, its keys covered, a thin layer of dust visible on its polished surface. "My mother played," Grant said quietly, following Ruby's gaze. "I keep meaning to have Sadie learn, but I can't teach her myself, and it seems wrong to let someone else." He trailed off, and Ruby understood. Some griefs were too tender to share with strangers. "Across the hall is my study," Grant continued, leading them to a smaller room lined with bookshelves. A large desk dominated the space, covered with ledgers and papers. "You won't need to worry about this room. I keep my accounts here and prefer to manage it myself. And here's the kitchen." Sadie pulled Ruby down the hallway with renewed enthusiasm. "It's the best room in the whole house because it's always warm and it smells good. And Papa lets me help make biscuits sometimes, even though I'm not very good at it yet." The kitchen was indeed warm, with a large cast-iron stove radiating heat and a table that could seat 8. Copper pots hung from hooks on the wall, and shelves held dishes and jars of preserved vegetables and fruits. Through a window, Ruby could see a small garden area, now buried under snow, and beyond that, the barn and outbuildings. "It's lovely," Ruby said softly, and meant it. The kitchen had the worn, comfortable feel of a space that was actually used, unlike the formal parlor. She could imagine cooking here, working at the wide counter, filling the room with the smells of bread and soup and roasted meat, if she could manage not to burn everything. "There's a pantry here," Grant indicated a door off the kitchen, "and a root cellar accessible from outside. We keep most of our stores there, potatoes, carrots, apples from last fall. One of the ranch hands, Miguel, keeps us supplied with fresh game when he can. We have chickens for eggs, and I usually butcher a steer in November to get us through winter." Ruby nodded, trying to absorb all the information. This was so different from the hand-to-mouth existence she'd been living, where she'd counted every penny and often gone to bed hungry so she could make her rent. Here, there was abundance, not wasteful excess, but the comfortable plenty of a well-run homestead. Upstairs, Grant said, leading the way back to the entrance hall. Sadie's room is at the end of the hall. My room is on the right. The room I'm offering you is on the left, across from mine. There are two other bedrooms, one we use for storage and one that was... He paused. One that was my wife's sewing room. I haven't touched it since she died. Maybe you'd like to... Well, we can discuss that later. Ruby followed him up the stairs, her hand trailing along the smooth banister. Sadie raced ahead, throwing open a door. This one's yours! The room was larger than Ruby had expected, with a double bed covered in a simple quilt, a chest of drawers, a wardrobe, and a small writing desk beneath a window that looked out over the snowy landscape. The walls were painted a pale blue, and white curtains framed the window. It was plain but clean, and more space than Ruby had called her own in years. The bed has extra blankets in the chest at the foot, Grant said. Winters get cold up here, and this side of the house catches the wind. If you need anything, more firewood, another lamp, warmer clothing, just let me know. I want you to be comfortable. It's perfect, Ruby whispered. And it was. Not because it was luxurious, it wasn't, but because it was hers. A space where she could close the door and breathe and exist without judgment. I'll let you settle in, Grant said. We usually eat supper around 6. Nothing fancy tonight. I've got stew from yesterday that just needs heating. Come down when you're ready. He left, Sadie trailing reluctantly behind after Ruby promised she'd come see her room very soon. Alone, Ruby sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new space. Her trunk sat at the foot of the bed, containing everything she owned. It seemed impossibly small now, in this room that offered so much more than mere shelter. She stood and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. She could see the barn from here, and horses moving in the corral, and smoke rising from what looked like a bunkhouse beyond the main buildings. This was a working ranch, a place of purpose and productivity, so different from the idle cruelty of town life. Ruby opened her trunk and began to unpack, hanging her 2 dresses in the wardrobe where they looked lost and shabby. She placed Thomas's pocket watch on the bedside table, along with the family Bible. Her hairbrush went on the dresser. She kept Grant's handkerchief in her pocket, somehow reluctant to put it away. When everything was arranged, she changed into her better dress, the gray wool that was only slightly less worn than the brown, and pinned her hair back more neatly. Looking at herself in the small mirror above the dresser, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The same plain face, the same too large body, but something in her eyes looked different. Less defeated, maybe. Or perhaps just stunned by the sudden change in her circumstances. She made her way downstairs, following the sound of Sadie's chatter toward the kitchen. Grant stood at the stove, stirring a large pot, while Sadie sat at the table, coloring in a book with intense concentration. "Smells good," Ruby said from the doorway, and Grant turned. "Just venison stew. Nothing special. Can you set the table? The dishes are in that cabinet." Ruby moved to help, grateful for something to do with her hands. She found heavy ceramic plates and plain silverware, setting 3 places at the scarred wooden table. It felt strange, this domestic tableau. Almost like playing house, except this was real. This was her life now, at least for as long as she could manage not to ruin it. "We usually say grace," Grant said when they were all seated, bowls steaming before them. "Would you like to lead it, or shall I?" "You, please," Ruby said quickly. She hadn't prayed aloud in front of anyone since Thomas died. Wasn't sure she remembered how. Grant reached out and took Sadie's hand, and after a moment, Sadie reached for Ruby's. The little girl's fingers were warm and sticky with pencil smudges. Ruby took Grant's other hand, his palm rough with calluses, his grip firm but gentle, and bowed her head. "Lord, we thank you for this food and the hands that prepared it," Grant said simply. "We thank you for bringing Mrs. Calder safely to Cedar Hollow, and we ask that you bless this household with peace and purpose. Amen." "Amen," Sadie echoed enthusiastically. "Can I eat now?" "May I eat now?" Grant corrected. "May I?" "Yes, you may." The stew was good, rich and hearty, with chunks of tender meat and vegetables that melted on Ruby's tongue. She tried to eat slowly, mindful of her manners, but hunger won out. She'd skipped breakfast that morning, too nervous about the memorial service, and lunch had been forgotten entirely in the chaos of leaving town. "This is delicious," she said, and meant it. "Miguel's a good hunter," Grant said. "We're never short of meat. He brought down this buck last week, young and tender. There's plenty more in the cold cellar if you want to try your hand at cooking tomorrow. Though I should warn you, I'm not particular. I grew up on ranch food, plain and filling. Anything that's hot and doesn't poison us is fine by me." "I'll try not to poison anyone," Ruby said with a small smile. "Though I can't promise much beyond that. My cooking skills are limited." "Papa burned the biscuits last week," Sadie offered helpfully. "They were black on the bottom, and he said words he's not supposed to say in front of me." Grant coughed. "Thank you for that reminder, sweetheart." "Mrs. Patterson used to say I was hopeless in a kitchen," Ruby admitted. "She let me rent the room cheap because I did mending for her, but she never let me near her stove after I set a potholder on fire." "How do you set a potholder on fire?" Sadie asked, fascinated. "By being distracted and careless," Ruby said. "I was thinking about something else and didn't notice it had fallen onto the burner until the smoke started." Grant's lips twitched. "Well, I appreciate the honesty. We'll figure it out together. Cooking isn't complicated. It just takes practice and attention. And if all else fails, we can survive on stew and bread." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, punctuated by Sadie's occasional observations about her day. Ruby found herself relaxing incrementally, the warmth of the food and the kitchen seeping into her bones. This was so different from the strained, silent meals she'd eaten alone in her room, or the awkward church suppers where she'd felt every eye on her, judging her portions and her appetite. After dinner, Ruby offered to wash the dishes, shooing Grant away when he tried to help. "You cooked. I'll clean. That's fair." She worked at the deep sink, heating water on the stove and scrubbing each dish carefully. Through the window, she could see the sun had fully set now, leaving the landscape dark except for the spill of light from the house windows. It felt safe somehow, this cocoon of warmth and light in the vast Montana darkness. Sadie appeared at her elbow, carrying a dish towel. "I'll dry." "You don't have to do that." "Papa says everyone in a household should help with chores," Sadie said seriously, climbing onto a stool to reach the counter. "Even me, and I'm only 6. Well, 6 3/4. My birthday's in April, and then I'll be 7. "That's a good philosophy," Ruby said, handing her a clean plate. "What do you usually help with?" "I feed the chickens every morning," Sadie said proudly. "And I help Papa muck out stalls sometimes, even though it's smelly. And I'm learning to curry the horses, but I'm not strong enough to do it really good yet. And I set the table and dry dishes and help fold laundry, and sometimes I dust, but Papa says I just move the dust around instead of getting rid of it." Ruby smiled despite herself. "You're very accomplished for 6 3/4. "Mama said everyone should know how to work hard," Sadie said, her voice matter-of-fact. "Papa says she was the hardest worker he ever knew. She used to make all our clothes and grow the garden and help with the horses, and she could shoot a rifle better than any of the ranch hands." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "I don't remember her very good," Sadie admitted quietly. "Just little bits, like how she smelled, like lavender and bread, and how she sang when she was cooking. Papa doesn't sing." She paused, carefully drying a bowl. "Do you sing?" "Not well," Ruby said. "But I can, if you'd like." "I think I'd like that. The house is too quiet sometimes. Papa's quiet, and the ranch hands are quiet, and even the horses are quiet except when they're not. It would be nice to have singing." They finished the dishes in companionable silence, and Ruby found herself thinking about Elizabeth Lawson, the woman whose absence shaped this household like a missing tooth. What had she been like? What had made Grant love her? And how could Ruby possibly fill even a fraction of the space she'd left behind? "Time for bed, Sadie," Grant called from the doorway. "It's past 8. "But I want to show Mrs. Calder my room." "Tomorrow. Mrs. Calder's had a long day." Sadie sighed dramatically but didn't argue. She carefully hung up her dish towel and turned to Ruby. "Will you still be here in the morning?" The question caught Ruby off guard. "Of course. Why would I leave?" "Sometimes when I go to sleep, things are different when I wake up," Sadie said softly. "Mama was here, and then she wasn't. Our last housekeeper said she'd stay, but then she left in the middle of the night. I just want to make sure you're real." Ruby knelt down, ignoring the protest of her knees, and looked the little girl in the eye. "I'm real, Sadie. And I promise I'll be here in the morning. I'll come to your room as soon as I wake up, all right? You can check. Sadie studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. All right. Good night, Mrs. Calder. Good night, sweetheart. After Sadie had gone upstairs with her father, Ruby stood in the kitchen listening to the creak of floorboards overhead and the murmur of Grant's voice as he read his daughter a bedtime story. The domesticity of it made her chest ache. This was what she'd imagined when she married Thomas: children and bedtime stories and the comfortable rhythms of family life. But Thomas had been so sick those last years, his lungs weak from breathing forge smoke, and there had never been children, never even the possibility of them. She walked through the ground floor, turning down lamps and checking that the stove was properly banked. In the parlor, she paused by the piano and lifted the cover from the keys. They gleamed white and black in the dim light. On impulse, she pressed middle C. The note rang out, pure and clear, sustained by the silence around it. Do you play? Ruby spun around, startled. Grant stood in the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his expression unreadable. No, Ruby said quickly, dropping the key cover back into place. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. It's fine, Grant said, waving off her apology. The piano should be played. Elizabeth would have hated the idea of it sitting there silent. He moved into the room, running his hand along the piano's curved edge. She played beautifully, learned from her mother, who learned from hers. She tried to teach me once, but I've got hands better suited to ropes and shovels than music. It's a beautiful instrument. It is. Grant was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking I should get it tuned. Maybe hire someone to teach Sadie. She's got her mother's ear for music. She can hear when a horse is lame from the rhythm of its gait, or when a board's going to crack before it actually does. That kind of sensitivity should be cultivated. I think that's a wonderful idea, Ruby said. Grant looked at her then, really looked at her, and Ruby felt suddenly self-conscious. What did he see? The same awkward, overweight widow that everyone else saw, or something different? You were good with her tonight, he said finally. With Sadie. Natural. She doesn't warm up to people easily. Her last 3 housekeepers barely got a word out of her, but she talked your ear off at dinner. She's easy to talk to, Ruby said. She's honest. No pretense, no judgment, just genuine curiosity about the world. She's lonely, Grant said quietly. The ranch hands are good men, but they're rough types, not much for conversation with a 6-year-old. And I'm not... He paused, seeming to search for words. I'm not good with feelings. Never have been. I can teach her to ride and rope and mend fences, but the other stuff, the crying and the questions about her mother and the fears that wake her up at night, I don't know how to handle that. You're handling it fine, Ruby said gently. You're here. You're trying. That's more than a lot of fathers do. Is it enough, though? Grant turned away, staring out the dark window. Sometimes I think I should have remarried right away, found her a new mother before she could even remember the old one. Would have been kinder, maybe. Clean break. I don't think grief works like that, Ruby said. Clean breaks just leave ragged edges that never heal right. Grant looked at her over his shoulder. That sounds like experience talking. Maybe it is. Ruby folded her arms across her chest, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the house. People kept telling me to move on after Thomas died, to put it behind me and look to the future, as if love was something you could just pack away in a trunk and forget about. But you wore your wedding dress to his memorial, Grant said, 3 years later. Because I didn't want to forget, Ruby said fiercely. Everyone else had forgotten him, forgotten us, forgotten that we mattered, and I wouldn't let him disappear like he'd never existed, even if it made me look ridiculous, even if everyone laughed. They're small people, Grant said quietly. Small lives, small minds, small hearts. They can't comprehend grief that big, so they mock it. Make it smaller, make it manageable, make it something they can dismiss. Ruby stared at him, surprised by the raw understanding in his words. Yes, exactly that. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 people who'd loved and lost, who'd been judged and found wanting by a town that had never bothered to truly see them. I should let you rest, Grant said finally. Tomorrow we'll be busy. I'll introduce you to the ranch hands, show you where everything is, go over the daily routine. Nothing complicated, but there's a lot to remember at first. I'll do my best, Ruby promised. That's all I ask. Grant moved toward the door, then paused. Ruby, Mrs. Calder, I just want to say, what you did today took courage. Coming here, taking this chance. I know it can't be easy trusting a stranger, but I meant what I said. You have a place here for as long as you want it. No pressure, no expectations beyond honest work and kindness to my daughter. And if anyone makes you feel less than welcome, you tell me immediately. This is your home now, too. Ruby's throat tightened. Thank you, she whispered. After he left, she stood in the parlor for a long time, listening to the house settle around her. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked as Grant moved through his nightly routine. Outside, wind whispered around the eaves, and somewhere far off, a coyote called. But inside, there was warmth and safety, and the possibility of something Ruby hadn't allowed herself to hope for in 3 long years. Belonging. She made her way upstairs to her new room, changed into her nightgown, and slipped between sheets that smelled of lavender and sunshine. The bed was soft, the quilt heavy and warm. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on velvet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, burned meals and broken dishes and all the ways she would inevitably fall short. But tonight, in this quiet room in this silent house, Ruby let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved this second chance. She fell asleep thinking of Sadie's smile and Grant's steady kindness, and the way the house had felt when they'd all sat down to dinner together, like a family, however imperfect and improvised, like home. The next morning, Ruby woke to pale sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of chickens clucking somewhere outside. For a moment, she was disoriented, expecting to see the cramped walls of her room above the seamstress shop. Then memory returned, and with it, a flutter of panic. What if she'd dreamed the whole thing? What if she was still in town, still alone, still... A soft knock sounded at her door. Mrs. Calder, are you awake? You promised to come see my room. Ruby smiled despite her anxiety. Real. This was real. I'm awake, Sadie. Give me a moment to dress. She scrambled into her brown dress, splashed water on her face from the pitcher on the washstand, and pinned her hair back hastily. When she opened the door, Sadie stood there in a flannel nightgown, her dark curls a wild tangle, her face alight with excitement. You're still here. I promised I would be, Ruby said gently. Come see. Sadie grabbed her hand and pulled her down the hall to a room at the far end. This is my room. Papa built the bed himself, and Mama made the quilt before she got sick, and I have my own bookshelf and everything. The room was small but cheerful, with a single bed covered in a patchwork quilt of blues and greens, a bookshelf overflowing with picture books, and a small table and chairs clearly meant for tea parties or drawing. The walls were covered with Sadie's artwork, awkward but enthusiastic drawings of horses and houses and flowers. It's wonderful, Ruby said sincerely. This is my favorite book, Sadie said, pulling a worn volume from the shelf. It's about a girl who lives in the woods with her papa and they have adventures. Papa reads it to me, but sometimes he falls asleep in the middle because he's tired from working all day. Do you like to read? I love to read. Good. Then you can read to me when Papa's too tired. He won't mind. He says reading is important and I should do it every day. Sadie paused. Mrs. Calder, do you think you could maybe call me just Sadie without the miss part? We're going to be friends, and friends don't use miss and misses. At least not the ones in my books. Ruby's heart squeezed. I'd like that. But maybe when we're alone, your father might prefer. Papa won't care, Sadie said confidently. He's not stuffy like that. He says the ranch hands call him Grant when they're working, even though he's the boss, because we're all just people doing a job. All right then, Sadie it is, and you can call me Ruby if your father approves. Ruby, Sadie tested the name, smiling. I like it. It's pretty, like a jewel. Get dressed, sweetheart, Grant's voice came from the hallway. We've got chores to do before breakfast. Sadie scampered off to find clothes, and Ruby made her way downstairs, following the smell of coffee. Grant stood at the stove, frying bacon in a heavy skillet, his movements efficient and practiced. Good morning, Ruby said. Can I help? Coffee's hot if you want some, Grant said. And if you want to try your hand at biscuits, the flour's in that tin, and there's lard in the pantry. But no pressure. I can make them if you'd rather watch and learn. Ruby took a deep breath. I'll try. You'll have to tell me if I'm doing it wrong. Can't be worse than my first attempt, Grant said with a rare smile. I added salt instead of sugar and wondered why they tasted like the bottom of the ocean. Ruby found herself smiling back as she gathered ingredients. Maybe she could do this. Maybe, with patience and practice and people who didn't expect perfection, she could actually learn to be useful. The biscuits came out lopsided and a little too brown on the edges, but they were edible. Sadie declared them almost as good as Papa's, which Ruby took as high praise. They ate at the kitchen table, bacon and biscuits and eggs scrambled with cheese, and Ruby felt the domestic rhythm of it settle into her bones. This was what life could be. Simple, nourishing, shared. After breakfast, Grant took her on a proper tour of the ranch. He introduced her to Miguel, a weathered man in his 50s who nodded politely and said very little, and to Jake, a younger cowhand with a ready smile and an easy manner. Both men treated her with courtesy, showing none of the sly judgment she'd grown accustomed to in town. Mrs. Calder will be managing the house, Grant told them. If you need anything, laundry, meals brought out for branding, medical supplies, you go through her. Understood? Yes, sir, Jake said, and Miguel nodded. Ruby felt a flicker of pride at being given such responsibility, even as anxiety curled in her stomach. What if she failed? What if she couldn't manage even these basic tasks? But as the day wore on, as she learned where things were kept and how the household ran and what was expected of her, Ruby began to feel something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Purpose. She had a purpose again. And maybe, if she worked hard enough and didn't burn down the kitchen, she might actually deserve it. The days at Cedar Hollow fell into a rhythm that surprised Ruby with its steadiness. She woke each morning to the sound of roosters and Sadie's eager knock on her door, dressed quickly in the cold dawn light, and made her way downstairs to start breakfast. The meals were simple, far simpler than what Elizabeth Lawson had probably made, but they were hot and filling, and neither Grant nor Sadie complained when the eggs were slightly rubbery or the porridge a bit too thick. By the end of the first week, Ruby had only set one dish towel on fire, barely singed really, and had broken just 2 plates. Grant had simply swept up the shards without comment and told her where to find replacements. His patience was both comforting and bewildering. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to lose his temper or show his true intentions, but he remained consistently kind, consistently respectful, treating her exactly as he'd promised, as an employee whose work he valued. It was Sadie, though, who truly won Ruby's heart. The little girl followed her everywhere, chattering about everything and nothing, asking endless questions and offering enthusiastic help with every task. She was there when Ruby fed the chickens each morning, laughing when Mrs. Fuzzybottom pecked at Ruby's skirts. She was there when Ruby struggled with the laundry, helping wring out sheets and hang them on lines stretched across the kitchen. She was there at night, curled against Ruby's side as Ruby read aloud from her storybooks, her small body growing heavy with sleep. "You're good for her," Grant said one evening after Ruby had carried a sleeping Sadie upstairs. They stood in the hallway, their voices hushed. "She hasn't been this happy since before Elizabeth died." "She's easy to love," Ruby said simply. Grant looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. "Yes, she is." The second week brought the first real test. Grant mentioned they'd need to go into town for supplies. Flour and sugar were running low, and he needed to order some equipment from the hardware store. Ruby felt her stomach clench at the thought of returning to Cedar Ridge, of facing those judgmental stares and cruel whispers. "You don't have to come," Grant said, reading her expression. "I can manage the shopping myself." "No," Ruby said, forcing steel into her voice. "I should learn what we need and where to get it. I can't hide here forever." "You're not hiding," Grant said firmly. "You're living your life. There's a difference." But Ruby insisted, and the following Saturday they loaded into the wagon, Grant and Ruby on the bench seat, Sadie bouncing between them, excited for the rare trip to town. The ride took over an hour, and with each mile, Ruby felt her anxiety growing. What would people say when they saw her with Grant? What new gossip would they create? "Hold your head high," Grant said quietly as they entered Cedar Ridge's main street. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." Ruby tried to believe him. She really did. But when they climbed down from the wagon in front of Morrison's general store, and she saw Margaret Finch standing on the boardwalk staring at them with naked curiosity, Ruby's resolve nearly crumbled. "Grant Lawson," Margaret called out, her voice carrying, "I heard you'd taken on help, but I had no idea it was poor Ruby Calder. How charitable of you." The word charitable dripped with insinuation. Ruby felt her face burn, but Grant's hand came to rest at the small of her back, that same gesture of support he'd shown at the church. "Mrs. Calder is my housekeeper and companion to my daughter," Grant said, his tone absolutely level. "I'm fortunate to have found someone so capable and kind. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have shopping to do." He guided Ruby past Margaret and into the store, Sadie skipping ahead. Behind them, Ruby heard Margaret's affronted gasp, but Grant didn't look back, and eventually Ruby didn't either. Inside the store, Mr. Morrison greeted them with professional courtesy, showing none of Margaret's malice. He helped them select what they needed, and when Grant stepped away to examine some tools, the shopkeeper leaned across the counter toward Ruby. "Don't mind Margaret Finch," he said quietly. "She's got nothing better to do than stick her nose in other people's business. You're doing good work out at Cedar Hollow. I can see it in the little one. She's blooming like a spring flower, that girl. Grant made the right choice bringing you on." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Call me Henry, and you come back whenever you need anything. I'll make sure you're treated right in my store." They finished their shopping and loaded the supplies into the wagon. As they prepared to leave, a familiar figure stepped out from the alley beside the hardware store. Victor Hale, dressed impeccably as always, his silver hair gleaming in the winter sun. "Ruby," he said smoothly, ignoring Grant entirely, "I've been hoping to run into you. I wanted to apologize for my behavior at the church. I was concerned for your welfare, but I expressed it poorly." "No apology necessary," Ruby said stiffly. "If you'll excuse us—" "I also wanted to extend an invitation," Victor continued, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I'm hosting a small dinner party next Saturday. Nothing elaborate, just a few friends. I thought you might enjoy an evening of civilized company. You could bring Mr. Lawson and his daughter, of course." "We're not interested," Grant said flatly. Victor's smile tightened. "I was speaking to Ruby, actually. Surely she's capable of answering for herself." "Mrs. Calder is employed by me," Grant said, his voice carrying an edge now. "And I don't appreciate you cornering her while she's working. So I'll say it again, we're not interested. Now step aside." For a moment, Victor's mask slipped, and Ruby saw the anger beneath. The same anger she'd seen 2 years ago when she'd finally refused his help and the strings attached to it. But he recovered quickly, stepping back with exaggerated courtesy. "As you wish. The invitation remains open, Ruby, should you change your mind. It would be a shame to waste your life in isolation, serving a man who'll never see you as anything more than hired help." Grant tensed, but Ruby put her hand on his arm. "Let's go," she said quietly. "He's not worth it." They climbed into the wagon and headed out of town, Sadie mercifully silent for once, sensing the tension between the adults. It wasn't until they were several miles out that Grant finally spoke. "I'm sorry about that. About him." "You have nothing to apologize for," Ruby said. "Victor Hale has been trying to control my life since Thomas died. I'm grateful you stood up to him, but I should learn to do it myself." "You did do it yourself," Grant pointed out. "You told me to let it go. You chose to leave instead of engaging with his manipulation. That took strength." Ruby had never thought of it that way. She'd always seen her retreat as cowardice, but maybe Grant was right. Maybe choosing not to fight wasn't the same as surrendering. "What did he mean about helping you?" Grant asked carefully. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but if there's something I should know—" Ruby took a deep breath. She owed Grant the truth, even if it was ugly. "After Thomas died, I had nothing. No money, no family, no prospects. Victor came to me offering assistance, a loan to help me get on my feet," he said. "But it became clear very quickly that he expected compensation. The kind you don't put in a ledger book." Grant's jaw tightened. "Did he—" "No," Ruby said quickly. "I refused him, but he didn't take it well. He spread rumors about me, implied that I'd already been compensated and was now ungrateful. That's why people in town look at me the way they do." It's not just that I'm a widow or that I've gained weight or that I wore my wedding dress to a memorial service. It's that Victor Hale told everyone I was a woman of loose morals who'd thrown herself at him and then rejected him when he wouldn't marry me. That's a lie, Grant said flatly. Of course it is. But the truth doesn't matter much when someone like Victor is telling the lie. He's wealthy, respected, charming. I'm nobody. People believed him. I don't. Ruby looked at Grant, at his weathered profile and the firm set of his mouth, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest. I know, that means more than you can imagine. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking beneath them, the landscape stark and beautiful in the winter light. Finally, Sadie spoke up from between them. I don't like that man, she announced. He has mean eyes. You're very perceptive, sweetheart, Grant said. What's perceptive mean? It means you notice things other people miss. Oh, Sadie considered this. Then I'm very perceptive about lots of things, like how Ruby only burns food when she's thinking about sad stuff, and how you smile when you watch her reading to me even though you try to hide it, and how Mrs. Fuzzybottom is planning to peck my boots next time I feed her. I can tell. Ruby felt her cheeks heat at Sadie's observation about Grant smiling, and she carefully didn't look at him. But she could feel his attention on her, warm as sunshine. You're too smart for your own good, Grant said to his daughter, but there was affection in his voice. Mama used to say that too, Sadie said. She said being smart was good, but knowing when to be quiet was better. I'm still working on the quiet part. We noticed, Grant said dryly, and Ruby found herself laughing despite the lingering tension from their encounter with Victor. The rest of the journey passed more easily, and by the time they arrived back at Cedar Hollow, the incident had faded to a dull ache rather than a sharp pain. Ruby threw herself into unloading supplies and preparing supper, grateful for the distraction of work. That night, after Sadie had been put to bed, Grant found Ruby in the parlor. She'd been drawn to the piano again, lifting the key cover and pressing notes at random, creating a discordant but somehow soothing melody. I've been thinking, Grant said from the doorway, about what Victor said. Ruby's hand stilled on the keys. What about it? About you being just hired help. Grant moved into the room, his expression serious. I don't want you to feel that way. You're not just an employee, Ruby. You're part of this household, part of this family, if you want to be. Ruby's breath caught. I don't understand. Sadie adores you. In 3 weeks, you've given her what I couldn't in 2 years. Stability, affection, the feeling that she matters to someone beyond just duty. And you've given me something too. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Peace. This house feels like a home again instead of a mausoleum. That's not something I can put a wage on. I'm just doing my job, Ruby said, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Grant said firmly. You're doing so much more than that. You sing while you work, even though you said you can't sing well. And you're right, you can't, but it makes Sadie smile. You've started tending Elizabeth's herb garden, even though I never asked you to. You stay up late mending Sadie's clothes because you noticed the hems were getting short. Those aren't the actions of someone just doing a job. Those are the actions of someone who cares. Ruby felt tears slip down her cheeks. I do care. I care so much it scares me. Because I know this can't last forever. Eventually, you'll find someone suitable. Someone who can really be a mother to Sadie, a proper partner to you. Someone who won't embarrass you in town or burn dinner or Stop, Grant said, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He took her shoulders gently, making her look at him. Stop running yourself down. Stop believing the lies people have told you about your worth. You're good enough, Ruby. You're more than good enough. And I'm not looking for someone suitable. I'm looking at you. Ruby's heart hammered in her chest. Grant? I'm not declaring eternal love, Grant said quickly, as if worried he'd overstepped. I know we barely know each other. I know this is all very new, but I want you to know that you matter. To me, to Sadie, to this ranch. You're not temporary, not unless you choose to be. Ruby couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She'd spent 3 years believing she was worthless, that the best she could hope for was to be tolerated. And here was this quiet, steady man telling her she mattered, that she was wanted, that she belonged. Thank you, she managed finally. Thank you for seeing me." "Hard not to," Grant said with a slight smile. "You're kind of taking over my house." Ruby laughed through her tears. "I promised to stop rearranging your kitchen." "Don't you dare. It actually makes sense now." Grant released her shoulders but didn't step back. "I mean what I said, Ruby. You have a place here, for as long as you want it." Ruby nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Grant studied her face for a moment longer, then stepped back, giving her space to breathe. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's Sunday. We don't work on Sundays unless the animals demand it. We usually spend the day quiet. Reading, maybe a ride if the weather's good. You should take the day for yourself." After he left, Ruby sat at the piano for a long time, her fingers resting on the keys without pressing them. Grant's words echoed in her mind, warm and solid as a wool blanket. She mattered, she belonged, she was wanted. It was almost too much to believe. The following weeks brought a subtle shift in the household dynamic. Grant began lingering in the kitchen after breakfast, helping Ruby clean up while Sadie did her morning chores. He started teaching Ruby to ride, taking her out on a gentle mare named Daisy and showing her the boundaries of the ranch. He included her in decisions about the household, what supplies they needed, how to organize the pantry, whether to hire additional help for spring branding. Ruby found herself relaxing incrementally, shedding the defensive armor she'd worn for so long. She laughed more easily, spoke her mind more freely, allowed herself to take up space without apologizing. Sadie thrived under the attention, her natural exuberance no longer tempered by the fear that any adult in her life might disappear without warning. But peace never lasts forever on a frontier ranch, and Ruby should have known their fragile happiness couldn't remain untested. It was a Wednesday in mid-March when trouble arrived. Ruby was in the kitchen, attempting to make bread, her fourth attempt, and this time it actually looked like it might rise properly, when she heard horses approaching at a gallop. Through the window, she saw two riders thundering up the drive, one of them waving his hat urgently. Grant appeared from the barn, Miguel close behind, and the riders pulled up hard, their horses lathered and blowing. "Grant!" one of them shouted. Ruby recognized him as Tom Cooper, who owned the ranch to the west. "We've got problems. Someone's been cutting fences on my north pasture, running off my cattle. Just found 3 head dead in the ravine. Looks like they stampeded them deliberately. And I'm not the only one. Jim Hawthorne lost cattle too, and so did the Hendersons." Grant's expression darkened. "When?" "Last few nights. Whoever's doing it knows what they're about, cutting the right sections, spooking the herds toward rough country where they're likely to injure themselves or get lost. This isn't random mischief. This is someone trying to hurt us." Ruby's hand stilled on the bread dough. She watched Grant's face, saw the grim set of his jaw, the calculating look in his eyes. This was the rancher, the businessman, the man who protected what was his. "Get the men together," Grant said. "Every ranch that's been hit, we ride out tonight and set watches. Whoever's doing this is getting bold. They'll likely try again soon. We catch them in the act, we'll have our answer." Tom nodded and wheeled his horse, galloping back down the drive. Grant turned to find Ruby watching from the kitchen window. Their eyes met, and even across the distance she could see his concern, not for the cattle, but for her and Sadie, left unprotected if he rode out. He strode into the house, his boots heavy on the wood floor. "Ruby, I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to be gone tonight, possibly several nights, until we catch whoever's sabotaging the ranches. Jake will stay here to keep watch over the house. Keep the doors locked. Don't answer to anyone you don't know. And if anything seems wrong, anything at all, you fire 1 shot from the rifle I keep in my study. The men will hear it and come running." "I understand," Ruby said, trying to keep her voice steady, even though fear curled in her stomach. "But Grant, why would someone do this? What do they gain from running off cattle?" "Could be a lot of reasons," Grant said grimly. "Revenge, trying to force us into selling, or just meanness. Some men like causing destruction." He paused, then added quietly, "Or someone might be trying to weaken us before making some kind of move. Either way, we're going to stop it." He showed her where the rifle was kept, how to load it, how to aim. Ruby had never touched a gun before, and the weight of it scared her, but she forced herself to pay attention. Sadie would be depending on her if something happened. That evening, as the sun set in shades of orange and purple, Grant and Miguel rode out with Tom Cooper and half a dozen other men from neighboring ranches. Jake took up a position in the barn where he could see both the house and the approach roads. Ruby locked the doors as instructed, checked on Sadie, who was already asleep, oblivious to the danger, and sat in the darkened parlor with the rifle across her lap, waiting. The night was quiet except for the usual sounds. Wind in the eaves, the distant call of an owl, the settling of the house around her. Ruby's mind raced with possibilities, each darker than the last. What if Grant didn't come back? What if he was hurt, or worse? What would she and Sadie do then? But beneath the fear was something else, something fierce and protective. This was her home now. Sadie was her responsibility, and if anyone tried to harm them, Ruby would find the courage to defend them even if it terrified her. The first night passed without incident. Grant returned at dawn, exhausted but unharmed, and slept for a few hours before heading out again. The second night was the same. But on the third night, everything changed. Ruby woke to the sound of gunfire, distant but unmistakable, echoing across the dark landscape. She bolted upright, heart pounding, and grabbed the rifle. Through her window she could see lights moving on the northern ridge, hear shouting carried on the wind. Footsteps pounded up the stairs, and Sadie burst into Ruby's room, her face pale with fear. "What's happening? Where's Papa?" "He's all right," Ruby said, hoping it was true. She pulled Sadie close, wrapping her arms around the trembling child. "Your Papa and the other ranchers are dealing with some trouble. We're safe here." More gunfire, closer now. Ruby's hand shook as she held the rifle, torn between staying with Sadie and going to check on Jake. Before she could decide, a figure appeared at her window. Jake, his face urgent in the moonlight. "Mrs. Calder, we got him. Grant's bringing in the rustlers now. Looks like 3 of them. You might want to come down, but keep Sadie inside." Ruby nodded, relief flooding through her. She settled Sadie in her own bed with strict instructions to stay put, then hurried downstairs. Through the kitchen window, she watched as riders approached, Grant in the lead, with Miguel and Tom Cooper flanking 3 bound men on horseback. As they drew closer, lamplight from the barn illuminated their faces, and Ruby felt her blood run cold. One of the captured men was Victor Hale. Not Victor himself, but his foreman, a man Ruby had seen before standing behind Victor at various town functions, carrying out his employer's orders. And if the foreman was involved, then Victor... Grant dismounted and strode toward the house. His face was hard as stone, his eyes blazing with controlled fury. He found Ruby in the kitchen and stopped, seeming to gather himself. "It was Victor Hale behind this," he said without preamble. "His men have confessed, said he paid them to harass the outlying ranches, make life hard for those of us who don't bow to his influence. He's been trying to force us into selling to him at reduced prices, consolidate his holdings." Ruby felt sick. "Why? He's already wealthy. Why would he do this?" "Because he can," Grant said flatly. "Because he's used to getting what he wants, and he doesn't like being told no." He paused, his gaze searching Ruby's face. "There's more." One of the men said Victor was particularly interested in making sure Cedar Hollow suffered, said something about teaching someone a lesson about refusing his generosity. The meaning was clear, and Ruby felt her knees weaken. This was her fault. Victor was punishing Grant for hiring her, for protecting her, for offering her the dignity Victor had tried to buy. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. This is because of me." "No," Grant said fiercely, crossing the room to grip her shoulders. "This is because of Victor Hale's cruelty and entitlement. You did nothing wrong. You hear me? Nothing." But Ruby couldn't stop the guilt from flooding through her. Because of her, Grant had been endangered, his livelihood threatened, his ranch targeted, all because she dared to believe she deserved better than Victor's poisoned charity. "What happens now?" she asked through numb lips. "Now we involve the law," Grant said. "Tom's already ridden to get the marshal. Victor Hale is going to answer for what he's done." But even as Grant spoke with such certainty, Ruby saw the grim reality. Victor was powerful, connected, influential. Would a marshal really arrest him based on the word of hired hands who could be accused of acting on their own? Or would Victor find a way to twist this around, to make himself the victim and Ruby the cause of all the trouble? She'd learned the hard way that truth didn't always prevail against wealth and charm. And as dawn broke over Cedar Hollow, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Ruby couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The marshal arrived at Cedar Hollow just after noon, a lean man in his 50s with silver at his temples and eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. Marshal William Dutton had served the territory for 20 years, and his reputation for fairness was matched only by his reputation for stubbornness. He listened to Grant's account, interviewed the captured men separately, and examined the cut fences himself before returning to the house where Ruby had prepared coffee and sandwiches for the assembled ranchers. "It's clear enough what happened," Dutton said, accepting a cup of coffee from Ruby with a nod of thanks. "These men were paid to sabotage your operations. The question is whether we can prove Victor Hale gave the orders or if he'll claim they acted independently." "They named him," Grant said. "All three of them." "The word of paid criminals against a respected businessman," Dutton said, not unkindly. "You know how that plays in court, Grant. We'll need more than testimony from men trying to save their own skins." Ruby stood by the stove, listening to the conversation with growing dread. She'd known this would happen. Victor was too clever to leave evidence, too well connected to be brought down by the word of hired hands. He'd walk away from this unscathed, while the men who'd actually done the work would hang. "There has to be something," Tom Cooper said. "Some record of payment, some letter, something that connects him directly." "If there is, it'll be in his office or his home," Dutton said. "And I can't search either without a warrant, which I can't get without evidence. We're chasing our tails here, gentlemen." Ruby's mind raced. She knew Victor's habits, knew his arrogance. He kept meticulous records of all his business dealings. She'd seen the ledgers herself years ago when he'd tried to convince her to accept his loan. He documented everything, convinced his power made him untouchable. If there was evidence, it would be in his study, probably locked in the desk where he kept his private papers. "I could get it?" Ruby heard herself say. Every head in the kitchen turned toward her. Grant's expression shifted from surprise to immediate denial. "Absolutely not. I know where he keeps his private records," Ruby continued, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've been in his house before, when he was trying to convince me to accept his help after Thomas died. He showed me his study, his ledgers. He was proud of them, wanted to demonstrate his success. If there's proof of payment to those men, it'll be in his desk." "Ruby, no," Grant said firmly. "It's too dangerous. If he caught you—" "He won't catch me," Ruby said, though her heart hammered at the thought. "There's a church social this Saturday. Victor always attends. He never misses an opportunity to be seen and admired. His house will be empty except for his housekeeper, and she's half deaf and spends most of her time in the kitchen. I could slip in through the study window. It doesn't latch properly. I remember Victor complaining about it. Find what we need and be gone before anyone notices." "That's breaking and entering," Dutton said. "Even if you found evidence, it might not be admissible in court if it was obtained illegally." "But it would tell you where to look," Ruby countered. "You could get your warrant based on what I find, claim an anonymous tip. It's not perfect, but it's better than letting Victor get away with this." Grant stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Can we speak privately, Mrs. Calder?" Ruby followed him out of the kitchen and into the parlor, where he rounded on her with an expression caught between anger and fear. "What are you thinking? This isn't some adventure from one of Sadie's books. This is real danger. If Victor catches you in his house, there's no telling what he'll do." "I know that," Ruby said quietly. "But this is my fault, Grant. Victor targeted you because of me, because I'm here, because you stood up for me. I can't let you lose everything because I was too much of a coward to face him." "You're not a coward," Grant said fiercely. "And this isn't your fault. Victor Hale is responsible for his own actions, not you." "But I can help fix it," Ruby insisted. "I'm the one person who can get into that house without raising immediate suspicion. If anyone sees me, I can claim I was coming to apologize to Victor, to accept his invitation to dinner. He'd believe that. He's arrogant enough to think I'd eventually crawl back to him." Grant's jaw tightened. "I don't like this. I don't like putting you in danger." "I'm already in danger," Ruby said softly. "We all are. Victor won't stop with the cattle. He'll keep pushing, keep finding ways to hurt you, until he gets what he wants. And what he wants is to prove that people like us, people who don't bow to him, can be broken. I won't let him win." They stared at each other for a long moment, and Ruby saw the war playing out behind Grant's eyes, his desire to protect her battling against his recognition that she was right. Finally, he released a long breath. If we do this, and I mean if, then we do it carefully. We plan every detail. You go in, find what we need, and get out immediately. No heroics, no confrontations. You understand? Ruby nodded, relief flooding through her even as fear coiled tighter in her stomach. I understand. They returned to the kitchen, where the assembled men were debating the legal ramifications of various plans. Grant cut through the discussion. Ruby's going to attempt to find evidence in Victor's study. We'll do it Saturday during the church social. Dutton, you'll need to be ready to act immediately if she finds anything. Tom, Jim, you'll create a distraction at the social. Keep Victor occupied. Make sure he doesn't leave early. Miguel, Jake, you'll be stationed near Victor's property, ready to provide help if something goes wrong. And what will you be doing? Ruby asked. I'll be in the wagon a block from Victor's house, waiting for you, Grant said in a tone that brooked no argument. If anything goes wrong, you run to me. We leave town immediately and sort out the consequences later. Your safety comes first. Over the next 3 days, they refined the plan until Ruby could recite every detail in her sleep. She would arrive at the social with Grant and Sadie, seeming to attend like any normal family. After an hour, she would complain of a headache and ask to return home. Grant would insist on seeing her back, but she would convince him to stay with Sadie. She would take the wagon, drive to a spot 2 blocks from Victor's house, then approach on foot through the alley that ran behind his property. The window in Victor's study faced the garden and was partially concealed by an overgrown lilac bush. Ruby would open the window, slip inside, search the desk for evidence of payments to the 3 captured men, take any relevant documents, and leave the same way she'd entered. Total time inside the house, no more than 15 minutes. If she wasn't back to the wagon within 30 minutes of leaving the social, Grant would come looking for her. It was a simple plan, and Ruby knew from experience that simple plans were the ones most likely to succeed. But that didn't stop her hands from shaking when she tried to eat breakfast on Saturday morning, or her stomach from churning with anxiety as she dressed for the social in her better gray dress. Sadie sensed something was wrong and stuck close to Ruby all morning, her usual chatter subdued. Are you scared about going to town? She asked as Ruby braided her hair. A little, Ruby admitted. There was no point in lying to this perceptive child. Because of the mean people? Because I have to do something brave, and brave things are always scary. Sadie turned around on the stool, her blue eyes serious. Papa says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the thing even though you're scared. He says that's what Mama was like when she was sick. Really scared, but really brave at the same time. Ruby felt tears prick her eyes. She cupped Sadie's face gently. Your papa is a very wise man, and your mama must have been an extraordinary woman. She was, Sadie said simply. And so are you. That's why I'm not worried. Brave people always figure things out. The simple faith in Sadie's voice steadied Ruby more than any adult reassurance could have. She finished the braids, tied them with ribbon, and tried to ignore the dread building in her chest. The social was held at the church, the same building where Ruby had worn her wedding dress and faced public humiliation just 2 months earlier. Walking through those doors again felt like stepping back into a nightmare, but Grant's steady presence beside her and Sadie's small hand in hers gave her courage. The room was crowded with townspeople, tables laden with food, children running between the adults' legs. Ruby saw the familiar faces. Margaret Finch holding court near the punch bowl, Reverend Michaels making his rounds, Henry Morrison from the general store chatting with other businessmen. And there, in the center of it all, was Victor Hale, impeccably dressed, his smile charming as always, giving no indication that 3 of his hired men sat in jail awaiting trial for crimes committed at his order. Victor's eyes found Ruby almost immediately. His expression flickered, surprise, calculation, satisfaction, before settling into pleased welcome. He excused himself from his companions and crossed the room toward them. Grant, he said smoothly, how unexpected to see you at a social gathering. And Ruby, you look well. Rustic life seems to agree with you. Mr. Hale, Grant said, his voice absolutely neutral. I heard about your trouble with rustlers, Victor continued, his tone sympathetic in a way that made Ruby's skin crawl. Terrible business. I do hope the marshal catches the real culprit soon. These men he's arrested are claiming I was involved. Can you imagine? As if I would need to steal cattle from my neighbors. The desperation of criminals knows no bounds. Indeed, Grant said dryly. Victor's attention shifted fully to Ruby. I'm glad you came today. I was beginning to think you'd become a hermit out at Cedar Hollow. It's not healthy, isolating yourself from community. People begin to talk. People always talk, Ruby said, proud that her voice didn't shake. I've learned to live with it. Still, it would be a shame if your association with Grant's household damaged his reputation. He's worked hard to build his ranch. One wouldn't want to see that undermined by unfortunate connections. The threat was subtle but clear. Ruby felt Grant tense beside her, but before he could respond, Tom Cooper appeared at Victor's elbow with Jim Hawthorne in tow. Victor, just the man we needed. We're having a debate about the new railroad proposals, and Jim here says you've got inside information from the territorial governor. Care to settle the matter? Victor preened slightly. Well, I do maintain certain contacts in the capital. Let me share what I know. He allowed himself to be drawn away, already pontificating about his connections and influence. Ruby watched him go, this man who'd tried to control her, who'd spread lies about her, who was now threatening Grant's livelihood simply because she dared to refuse him. The next hour crawled by with agonizing slowness. Ruby made small talk with the few people willing to acknowledge her, helped Sadie fill a plate with food, and tried to ignore the whispers that followed her through the room. Finally, when she judged enough time had passed, she pressed her hand to her forehead and swayed slightly. Ruby? Grant was at her side immediately, concern genuine in his voice. What's wrong? Just a headache, Ruby said, making her voice weak. I think I need to go home and lie down. I'm sorry. I know we just got here. I'll take you home, Grant said immediately, exactly as planned. No, please, stay with Sadie. She's having fun, and I don't want to ruin her day. I can manage the wagon. It's not far. Ruby, I can't let you drive alone when you're unwell. Papa, Mrs. Morrison was going to show me the new kittens in her barn, Sadie interjected right on cue, her acting surprisingly convincing. Can't you stay just a little longer? Please? Ruby will be fine. She drives better than you anyway. Grant looked torn, which was also part of the act. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. All right, but you drive straight home and rest. I'll bring Sadie back within the hour. Thank you, Ruby said, and meant it for more than just the immediate situation. She made her way out of the church, feeling Victor's eyes on her back. Once outside, she walked to where the wagon was parked, climbed up, and guided the horses slowly down the main street. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe, but she forced herself to maintain a steady pace, just a woman going home because she wasn't feeling well. 2 blocks from Victor's house, she pulled the wagon into an alley and secured the horses. Then, checking to make sure no one was watching, she made her way on foot toward the large brick house that sat at the end of Elm Street, partially hidden by oak trees. The day was overcast, threatening snow, which meant fewer people out walking. Ruby moved quickly, but not so quickly as to attract attention, keeping her head down, her shawl pulled up. The alley behind Victor's house was empty, scattered with old crates and barrels. She counted houses until she found the right one, recognizing the elaborate garden that Victor maintained as a point of pride. The lilac bush was exactly where she remembered it, bare now in late winter but still providing cover. Behind it, the window to Victor's study was closed but not latched. She could see the gap where the frame didn't quite meet. Ruby glanced around one more time, saw no one, and pushed the window open. It moved smoothly, well-oiled hinges making no sound. Ruby hiked up her skirts, placed her hands on the sill, and hauled herself through with more grace than she'd expected. She landed on the study floor with a soft thump, her heart racing so fast she felt dizzy. The study was exactly as she remembered. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk that dominated the room. Ruby moved to the desk, tried the drawers. Locked, of course. But Victor was predictable in his arrogance. He kept the key in the same place he kept all his keys, in a small lacquered box on the mantelpiece. Ruby retrieved the box, found the right key by size, and returned to the desk. Her hands shook as she unlocked the drawers and began searching through papers. Contracts, deeds, correspondence. So much documentation of Victor's various business dealings. Where would he keep records of illegal payments? She was running out of time. 10 minutes already, and she'd found nothing. Ruby forced herself to think like Victor, prideful, meticulous, convinced of his own cleverness. He wouldn't hide the evidence because he didn't believe anyone would dare search for it. He'd keep it somewhere accessible, somewhere he could refer to it easily. The center drawer. Ruby pulled it open and found a leather-bound ledger. She flipped through the pages, scanning entries. There, 3 payments, each marked land acquisition, Cooper property, land acquisition, Hawthorne property, land acquisition, Lawson property. And beneath each notation, in Victor's precise handwriting, the names of the 3 men currently sitting in jail. Ruby's hands trembled as she pulled the relevant pages from the ledger, folding them carefully and tucking them into her bodice. She closed the drawer, locked it, returned the key to its box, and was halfway to the window when she heard the front door open. Her blood turned to ice. Victor wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be at the social for at least another hour. What had gone wrong? Mrs. Fletcher, Victor's voice called out. I've returned early. Would you bring tea to my study? Ruby had perhaps 30 seconds before Victor reached the study door. She dove toward the window, pushed it open, and was halfway through when her skirt caught on something. A nail, a splinter, she didn't know. She tugged desperately, heard fabric rip, and tumbled through the window into the lilac bush just as she heard Victor's study door open behind her. What the? Ruby didn't wait to hear more. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the scratches from the lilac branches, and ran. Behind her, she heard Victor shouting, heard the window slam open fully, heard him calling for someone to stop her. She ran through the alley, her breath coming in gasps, her skirts hiked up around her knees. A man appeared at the alley's end, one of Victor's men, and Ruby changed direction, cutting through a yard, vaulting a low fence with strength born of pure terror. She could hear pursuit behind her, getting closer. The wagon. She had to get to the wagon, but which way? The panic had disoriented her, and the streets all looked the same. Ruby burst onto a main road and nearly collided with a horse. The rider pulled up hard, and Ruby looked up to see Miguel. Mrs. Calder, come on! He reached down, and Ruby grabbed his arm, letting him haul her up behind him. Miguel kicked the horse into a gallop, and they raced through town, leaving shouts and confusion in their wake. Grant was waiting with the wagon, his face white with fear that turned to relief when he saw them. Miguel pulled up hard, and Ruby practically fell from the horse into Grant's arms. Did you get it? Grant asked urgently. Ruby nodded, unable to speak, and pulled the folded papers from her bodice. Grant took them, scanned them quickly, and his expression hardened with satisfaction. This is it. This proves everything. Victor saw me, Ruby gasped. He knows it was me. He'll do nothing, Grant said grimly, because we're going straight to Marshal Dutton with this evidence, and by the time Victor figures out what happened, he'll be the one in handcuffs. Get in the wagon. Miguel, ride ahead and make sure Dutton is ready. The next hours passed in a blur. Marshal Dutton examined the evidence, verified its authenticity, and assembled a group of deputies. By nightfall, Victor Hale was under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft and destruction of property, his protests of innocence falling on deaf ears in the face of his own meticulously documented crimes. The 3 captured men offered reduced sentences in exchange for testimony, confirmed every detail. Victor had hired them to harass the ranchers, intending to force them to sell their properties at a loss, which he would then buy and consolidate into a massive holding that would give him control over the entire region's cattle trade. The trial happened swiftly by frontier standards. Within 3 weeks, Victor was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison. His properties were seized to pay restitution to the ranchers he'd harmed, his reputation destroyed beyond repair. But Ruby took no satisfaction in Victor's downfall. The night of his arrest, after Sadie had been put to bed, she stood on the porch at Cedar Hollow, staring out at the dark landscape, and finally allowed herself to shake with the fear she'd suppressed all day. Grant found her there, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and simply stood beside her without speaking. Finally, Ruby found her voice. I could have gotten you killed, she whispered, if Victor had caught me. If something had gone wrong, but he didn't, and it didn't, Grant said quietly. You were brave, Ruby, braver than anyone had a right to ask. You saved not just my ranch, but 6 others. You stopped a man who thought he was above the law. I was terrified the entire time. That's what made it brave, Grant said, echoing Sadie's earlier words. And I want you to know something. What you did today, that wasn't about paying a debt or fixing something that was your fault. That was about being part of a community, standing up for what's right, protecting people you care about. That's what family does. Ruby looked at him, at this steady, honorable man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. Family, she repeated softly. If you want to be, Grant said, if you want to stay. Ruby thought about the months she'd spent at Cedar Hollow, about Sadie's laughter and the rhythm of ranch life, and the way this house had become home. She thought about how Grant looked at her, not with pity or judgment, but with respect and something else, something warmer that made her heart beat faster. I want to stay, she said, more than anything. Grant's hand found hers in the darkness, his grip warm and solid and real. They stood together on the porch, watching the stars emerge above the Montana landscape, and Ruby felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, exactly. There would still be hard days ahead, still whispers and judgment and the long road of learning to believe she was worthy. But for the first time in years, Ruby felt something better than peace. She felt like she belonged. Spring came to Cedar Hollow with a rush of green that transformed the harsh winter landscape into something almost magical. The snow melted in torrents, feeding streams that sparkled in the sunlight, and the meadows exploded with wildflowers, lupine and Indian paintbrush and delicate columbine that Sadie gathered by the armful to place in jars throughout the house. Ruby worked in Elizabeth's herb garden, coaxing life back into beds that had been neglected for 2 years, her hands deep in rich earth, her face tilted toward the sun. She'd been at Cedar Hollow for 4 months now, and the rhythm of ranch life had seeped into her bones. She woke without alarm to the rooster's call, made breakfast without burning it more often than not, spent her days in a comfortable cycle of work and rest and the simple pleasure of watching Sadie grow. The little girl had become the daughter Ruby had never thought she'd have, teaching her to read more difficult books, showing her how to braid her own hair, singing off-key lullabies that made Sadie giggle, but also somehow soothe her to sleep. And Grant had become something Ruby didn't have words for yet, something that made her heart beat faster when he walked into a room and made her feel safe in a way she'd never felt before. They'd settled into an easy partnership, working side by side with the comfortable silence of people who didn't need constant conversation to feel connected. But there were moments, hands touching as they passed dishes at dinner, his smile when he caught her singing while she worked, the way he looked at her sometimes with an expression that made her breath catch, that hinted at something deeper brewing beneath the surface. Ruby was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She turned to see Reverend Michaels riding up the path, his expression unusually grave, her stomach clenched with instinctive anxiety. The Reverend hadn't visited Cedar Hollow since before Elizabeth died, and his sudden appearance couldn't mean anything good. Grant emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers, his own expression wary. "Reverend, this is unexpected." "Grant!" Reverend Michaels dismounted stiffly, clearly uncomfortable. "I wonder if we might speak privately." "Anything you have to say can be said in front of Mrs. Calder," Grant said firmly. "She's part of this household." The Reverend's gaze flicked to Ruby, and she saw judgment there, thinly veiled beneath a mask of concern. "Very well. I've come as a representative of the church board. There's been talk about the arrangement here. A widow and a widower living under the same roof without proper chaperone, without marriage. It's causing scandal in town." Ruby felt her face burn with shame. She'd known this was coming, had felt it hovering like a storm cloud ever since Victor's arrest. With Victor gone, the town gossips had turned their attention to other targets, and Ruby's situation at Cedar Hollow was ripe for speculation. "What Mrs. Calder and I do is our own business," Grant said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Ordinarily, I would agree," the Reverend said, "but you have a young daughter to consider. What example are you setting for Sadie? And Mrs. Calder's reputation, what's left of it, is being further damaged by this living arrangement. People are saying, well, they're saying things I won't repeat." "Then don't repeat them," Grant said flatly, "and tell your church board that my household arrangements are not their concern." "I'm afraid it is our concern when it affects the moral fabric of our community," Reverend Michaels said, his tone sharpening. "I'm here to offer a solution. If you and Mrs. Calder were to marry, properly, in the church, it would legitimize the situation. Or if marriage is not your intention, then Mrs. Calder should seek employment elsewhere, somewhere her presence won't cause such controversy. Ruby felt the words like a physical blow. She'd been a fool to think she could build a life here, to think the town would ever accept her. The old shame came flooding back, and with it, the familiar voice in her head that said she didn't deserve happiness, didn't deserve love, didn't deserve anything but judgment and exile. "Get off my property," Grant said, his voice low and lethal, "and tell your church board that they can take their moral concerns and—" "Grant," Ruby interrupted quietly. She couldn't let him destroy his relationship with the church, with the town, for her sake. She'd already cost him too much. "Maybe the Reverend is right. Maybe it would be better if I left." Grant spun to face her, shock and anger warring in his expression. "What?" "I'm causing problems for you," Ruby said, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. "For Sadie. I never wanted that. I thought I could have a place here, but maybe I was wrong." "Ruby, no. I'll pack my things," Ruby said, turning away before he could see the tears in her eyes. She walked toward the house with her back straight, her head high, even as everything inside her crumbled. She'd made it as far as the porch when Sadie burst out of the house, her face stricken. "You can't leave. You promised you'd stay. You promised." Ruby knelt down, taking Sadie's hands in hers. "Sweetheart, sometimes promises are harder to keep than we think." "No." Sadie wrenched her hands away, tears streaming down her face. "You're just like everyone else. You say you'll stay and then you leave. You're a liar." The words cut deep, all the more because Ruby knew they came from a place of devastating loss. She reached for Sadie, but the little girl ran past her father, and the Reverend, toward the barn, her sobs echoing across the yard. Ruby stood slowly, watching her go, feeling her heart break. This was what she did. She hurt people, caused chaos, ruined everything she touched. She should never have let herself believe she could have a family, could have love, could have a home. "I hope you're satisfied, Rishi," Grant said to Reverend Michaels, his voice shaking with fury. "You just broke my daughter's heart in the name of moral righteousness." "Grant, I'm only trying to help." "You're not helping. You're judging. You and your church board and everyone in that sanctimonious town are so busy worrying about appearances that you can't see what actually matters." Grant stepped closer to the Reverend, his expression fierce. "Ruby Calder is the best thing that's happened to this household in 2 years. She's given my daughter stability and affection and taught her that good people exist in this world. She's worked harder than any 3 housekeepers I've hired, never complained, never asked for special treatment. She survived your town's cruelty and came here to build a new life, and she's done it with grace and courage that puts all of you to shame." "Be that as it may," the Reverend began. "I'm not finished," Grant cut him off. "You want to talk about what example I'm setting for Sadie? Let me tell you what I'm teaching her. I'm teaching her that kindness matters more than reputation, that people deserve second chances, that a person's worth isn't determined by their body size or their past mistakes or whether they conform to society's narrow expectations. Ruby has taught my daughter more about true Christian charity in 4 months than your church has in her entire life." Reverend Michael's face had gone pale. "Grant, please, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable," Grant said. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to ride back to town and tell your church board that my household is none of their business. And then you're going to think long and hard about what your church actually stands for. Because from where I'm standing, it's not love or compassion or any of the things Christ actually taught. It's judgment and gossip and making people feel small so you can feel superior." The Reverend opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and mounted his horse without another word. He rode away quickly, his back rigid with offended dignity. Grant watched him go, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists. Ruby stood frozen on the porch, stunned by Grant's defense of her. No one had ever stood up for her like that, had ever seen her worth and proclaimed it so fiercely. But even as warmth flooded through her at his words, the practical part of her brain recognized the cost. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "You need the church. Sadie needs the church. And You need to stop deciding what everyone else needs and start asking what you need," Grant said, turning to face her. His expression had shifted from anger to something more intense, more vulnerable. What do you want, Ruby? Not what you think you deserve, not what you think is right for everyone else. What do you actually want? Ruby's throat closed. She couldn't answer that question because the answer was too big, too terrifying. She wanted this, all of this. The ranch, the family, the man standing in front of her looking at her like she mattered. But wanting it didn't mean she deserved it, and wanting it didn't mean she wouldn't destroy it. I should find Sadie, she whispered, and fled before Grant could say anything else. She found Sadie in the barn loft, curled in the hay beside a mama cat and her kittens, crying as if her heart would never mend. Ruby climbed the ladder slowly, giving the child time to reject her if she wanted to. But when Ruby sat down in the hay beside her, Sadie immediately threw herself into Ruby's arms, sobbing against her chest. "Don't go," Sadie choked out between sobs. "Please don't go. I need you. Papa needs you. We're better when you're here." Ruby held her tight, rocking slightly, her own tears falling into Sadie's dark hair. "I don't want to go, sweetheart, but sometimes staying hurts the people we love." "That's stupid," Sadie said fiercely. "Leaving hurts more. When Mama died, it hurt so much I thought I'd die too. And then you came and it started hurting less, and now I can remember Mama without feeling like there's a hole in my chest. If you leave, it'll hurt again, and I don't want to hurt anymore." Ruby's breath hitched. She thought about Thomas, about how the grief had consumed her for so long that she'd forgotten how to live. She thought about that first night at Cedar Hollow, how she'd allowed herself to hope. And she thought about Grant's words, "Not what you think you deserve, but what you want." "Sadie," Ruby said slowly, "what if I stayed, but people in town were mean about it? What if they said cruel things about your papa and me?" "Then they're stupid, and I don't care what they think," Sadie said with 6-year-old certainty. "Papa says what matters is what's true, not what people say. And the truth is, you make us happy. That's what matters." Out of the mouths of babes, Ruby thought, remembering Grant's words from that first day. This child saw the truth so clearly, unburdened by adult fears and society's rules. Ruby had spent 3 years letting other people define her worth, letting their judgments become her internal voice. Maybe it was time to stop listening to them and start listening to the people who actually knew her, who actually cared. "All right," Ruby said, the words feeling like a leap from a cliff. "All right, I'll stay. But we need to do this right, for your sake, if not for mine and your papa's. We need to address the concerns properly." "How?" Sadie sniffled, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "I don't know yet," Ruby admitted, "but we'll figure it out. Together." They climbed down from the loft to find Grant waiting at the bottom of the ladder, his expression anxious. "Is she all right?" "We're both all right," Ruby said, and was surprised to find it was true. "But we need to talk, really talk, about what happens next." They sent Sadie to gather eggs, a task that would keep her occupied and give the adults privacy. Grant led Ruby to the porch, where they sat on the steps overlooking the ranch. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken feelings. "I meant what I said to the Reverend," Grant finally said. "Every word. You've transformed this place, Ruby, transformed us, and I won't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here." "But he wasn't entirely wrong," Ruby said carefully. "Our living arrangement is unconventional. People will talk, and that talk will eventually affect Sadie. We need to consider her future. What happens when she's older and wants to go to school dances or court young men? What happens if she's ostracized because her father's housekeeper is a woman with a questionable reputation? Then we make your reputation unquestionable," Grant said. He took a deep breath, and Ruby saw his hands tremble slightly as he turned to face her fully. "Ruby, I'm not good with words, I'm not romantic or poetic, but I know what I feel and I know what I want. I want you to stay, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife, as Sadie's mother, as my partner in building this ranch and this life." Ruby's heart stopped. She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Grant, I know this seems sudden," Grant continued, the words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them out before he lost courage. "I know we've only known each other 4 months, But Elizabeth and I only courted for 3 months before we married, and we had 20 good years together. Sometimes you just know when something's right. And this, you being here, you being part of our lives, this is right, Ruby. I feel it in my bones. You don't have to marry me to solve a social problem, Ruby said, her voice shaking. You don't have to sacrifice yourself to protect me. Is that what you think this is? Grant took her hands in his grip warm and solid. Ruby, I'm not asking you to marry me out of duty or propriety or to silence gossip. I'm asking because when I see you in my kitchen in the morning, I want that view for the rest of my life. I'm asking because when Sadie laughs at something you've said, I feel a happiness I thought died with Elizabeth. I'm asking because somewhere between that first day at the church and now, I fell in love with you, and I can't imagine my future without you in it. Ruby felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they weren't tears of shame or grief. They were tears of overwhelming emotion, of hope and fear and desperate longing all tangled together. I'm not beautiful, she whispered. I'm not graceful or educated or any of the things a man like you deserves. You're brave, Grant interrupted. You're kind. You're strong in ways that have nothing to do with physical strength. You make my daughter feel safe and loved. You make this house feel like a home. You climbed through a window to stop a criminal because it was the right thing to do, even though you were terrified. Ruby, you're everything I want and everything Sadie needs. The question isn't whether you're good enough for us. The question is whether we're good enough for you. Ruby looked at this man who'd given her dignity when she had none, who'd offered her a home when she was homeless, who'd defended her against a town's judgment, and now sat before her offering his heart. She thought about Thomas and the love they'd shared, and she knew in her soul that he would want this for her, would want her to be happy, to be loved, to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. Yes, she said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. Yes, I'll marry you. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because you've shown me that I deserve love, that I can have a family, that my story doesn't have to end in loneliness and shame. Because somewhere between that first day and now, I fell in love with you too, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that your faith in me wasn't misplaced. Grant's face transformed with a smile that took years off his weathered features. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and Ruby let herself sink into his embrace. For the first time in years, maybe in her entire life, she felt completely safe, completely accepted, completely loved. Ruby's gonna be my mama, Sadie's voice rang out across the yard, and they broke apart to see her running toward them, egg basket forgotten, her face alight with joy. You're getting married. That means Ruby stays forever. How did you? Grant started, but Sadie just grinned. I wasn't really gathering eggs. I was watching from the barn because I wanted to make sure you both said the right things. And you did. So now we can be a real family. Ruby laughed through her tears as Sadie crashed into them, throwing her arms around both adults. They sat there on the porch steps, the three of them tangled together, and Ruby felt something settle in her chest. Something that felt like peace, like home, like the ending she'd never dared to hope for. The wedding was planned for a month later, after the spring branding was complete. Ruby had worried about where to hold it. The church felt impossible after the Reverend's visit. But Grant had a better idea. They would marry at Cedar Hollow, under the cottonwood tree by the creek where Elizabeth had planted her herb garden, with just close friends and neighbors in attendance. Elizabeth would have liked that, Grant said. She always said the best ceremonies happened outdoors, where God's presence was more obvious than in any building. Ruby spent the intervening weeks preparing, and to her surprise, she wasn't alone in the work. Margaret Finch appeared at the ranch one morning, her expression carefully neutral, carrying a bolt of ivory fabric. I heard you're getting married, she said without preamble. I also heard you don't have a proper dress. This was my mother's wedding fabric. She never used it, and I thought perhaps you might want it. Ruby stared at her, speechless. Margaret Finch, who'd mocked her wedding dress at the memorial service, who'd called her charity case, was offering her a gift. Why? Ruby asked bluntly. Margaret had the grace to look ashamed. Because I was wrong about you. We all were. What you did, exposing Victor Hale. You saved a lot of families from ruin, including mine. My husband had already started negotiations to sell our farm to Victor at a loss. You stopped that. And I've watched you with Grant's little girl, seen how she's flourished. I was cruel to you, and I'm sorry. This doesn't make up for it, but it's a start." Ruby accepted the fabric, her hands trembling. "Thank you. This means more than you know." Other gifts followed. Henry Morrison donated supplies for the wedding meal. Tom Cooper offered his wife's help with cooking. The ranch hands pitched in to build a simple arbor for the ceremony. Even Reverend Michaels sent a stiff note offering his apologies and his blessing, though he declined to officiate. Instead, the circuit judge who'd presided over Victor's trial agreed to perform the ceremony, declaring it would be his honor to marry two people who'd shown such courage in the face of corruption. Ruby used the ivory fabric to make a simple dress, with a full skirt and fitted bodice that actually accommodated her figure rather than fighting it. She trimmed it with lace from one of Elizabeth's old dresses. Grant had offered it, saying Elizabeth would have wanted her belongings to be used, not preserved like museum pieces. Ruby felt strange wearing another woman's lace, but also honored, as if she were being given permission to step into this role, to be a mother to Elizabeth's daughter and a wife to Elizabeth's husband. The night before the wedding, Ruby sat with Sadie in her room, helping her prepare for bed. The little girl was practically vibrating with excitement about being a flower girl. "Do you think Mama knows?" Sadie asked suddenly, her voice small. "About you and Papa getting married?" Ruby's hand stilled in Sadie's hair. This was delicate territory. "What do you think?" "I think she does," Sadie said slowly. "And I think she's happy about it. Because Mama always wanted us to be happy, and we're happier with you here. That's what love is, right? Wanting people to be happy even if it means things are different?" "That's exactly what love is," Ruby said softly. "Your mama must have been a very wise woman." "She was," Sadie agreed, "and so are you. That's why you're both my mama. I just have one in heaven and one here. That's lucky, right? Most kids only get one." Ruby hugged her tight, overwhelmed by the simple generosity of this child's heart. "Yes, sweetheart. That's very lucky indeed." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect spring day that felt like a blessing. Ruby dressed carefully in her new gown, pinned her hair back with the ivory combs Grant had given her as a wedding gift, and looked at herself in the mirror. She wasn't beautiful, would never be beautiful by conventional standards, but she looked happy. She looked loved. And maybe that was its own kind of beauty. Grant had gone to stay with Tom Cooper the night before, observing the tradition of not seeing the bride before the ceremony. Now he stood under the arbor by the creek, wearing his Sunday suit with a white flower in his lapel, and when Ruby walked toward him across the spring grass, his face lit up with an expression that made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. Sadie walked ahead of her, scattering flower petals with enthusiastic abandon, and Ruby smiled at the sheer joy radiating from the child. This was what they were building, not just a marriage, but a family. Not just a household, but a home. The ceremony was simple. Judge Harrison spoke about courage and second chances, about building something strong on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. Grant's hands were steady as he slipped a simple silver band onto Ruby's finger, his voice firm as he promised to love and honor her for the rest of their days. Ruby's voice shook as she made her own vows, but the words came from her heart, promises to cherish this family they were building, to be a partner in the hard work of ranching and life, to love this man and his daughter with everything she had. When the judge pronounced them married and Grant kissed her, the small gathering of friends and neighbors applauded. Ruby heard a few sniffles, saw Henry Morrison wiping his eyes, and felt overwhelmed by the support surrounding them. These people had seen her at her lowest, had judged her, yes, but were now choosing to celebrate her happiness. The celebration afterward was joyful and uncomplicated. They ate beef and biscuits and the first strawberries of the season. Jake played a fiddle with surprising skill, and they danced on the grass, Sadie insisting on dancing with both her parents, Ruby's new title making the child glow with pride. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Ruby stood with Grant's arm around her waist and watched their friends laughing and talking, watched Sadie teaching the other children a game, and felt the final pieces of her broken heart click into place. "Happy?" Grant murmured in her ear. "More than I ever thought possible," Ruby admitted. That night, after the guests had left and Sadie had finally been persuaded to sleep, Ruby and Grant stood together in their bedroom, not the room she'd been given when she arrived, But the larger room that had been his was now theirs. It felt momentous and terrifying and absolutely right. "I never thought I'd have this again," Grant said quietly, his hands gentle as he helped her with the buttons on her dress. "A partner, a companion, someone to build a life with. Elizabeth was my first love, and that will always be true. But you're my second chance, Ruby. My opportunity to get it right this time, to appreciate every moment instead of taking it for granted." "I never thought I'd have it at all," Ruby confessed. "I thought love was something that happened to other people, that I'd already had my share with Thomas and should be grateful for that. I didn't know I could feel this way again, safe and wanted and home." They came together with a tenderness that brought tears to Ruby's eyes, and afterward, lying in Grant's arms in the darkness, Ruby thought about the journey that had brought her here, the humiliation at the memorial service, the desperate flight through the snow, the terror of breaking into Victor's house. All of it had led to this moment, to this bed, to this man holding her like she was precious. The months that followed were not without challenges. Ruby burned several more meals and broke her share of dishes. There were disagreements about how to manage the household, awkward moments as they learned to navigate shared space and merged lives. Sadie had occasional nightmares and moments of grief for her birth mother. The town gossips found new reasons to whisper, though the whispers were quieter now, less vicious. But they faced it all together, the three of them building a family one day at a time. Ruby learned to cook properly under Miguel's patient instruction, discovered she had a talent for managing the ranch's accounts, found confidence in her role as Sadie's mother. Grant opened up about his fears and hopes, shared stories of Elizabeth without pain, learned to accept help instead of carrying every burden alone. Sadie thrived, growing taller and more confident, her laughter filling the house that had been silent for too long. A year after the wedding, Ruby stood in the herb garden she'd reclaimed, one hand resting on her swelling belly, watching Grant teach Sadie to rope fence posts. The baby had been a surprise. Ruby had thought herself too old, her body too worn from hardship. But the doctor had confirmed it, and now life grew inside her, impossible and miraculous. "Mama," Sadie called, waving enthusiastically. "Did you see? I got it on the first try." "Mama." The word still made Ruby's heart swell. She waved back, then turned to look at the house. Her house, their house, home. The afternoon sun gilded the weathered wood, and through the kitchen window she could see the table where they'd share dinner tonight, the chairs where they'd sit together, the ordinary, sacred space of family life. She thought about the woman who'd stood in a church 4 months pregnant with hope and wearing a wedding dress that didn't fit, certain she'd never deserve love again. She thought about how wrong she'd been, how much she'd almost missed by believing other people's judgments instead of her own worth. Ruby Lawson, no longer Calder, but carrying that name in her heart alongside the new one, placed her hand over her growing child and smiled. Life was hard here on the frontier. The winters were brutal, the work was endless, and there would always be people ready to judge and condemn. But there would also be this: love and laughter and second chances, families built from broken pieces, homes made from courage and choice. And that, Ruby had learned, was more than enough. It was everything. As the sun dipped toward the mountains and Grant called them in for supper, Ruby walked toward her family with her head high and her heart full, finally believing what Grant had tried to tell her from the very beginning. She was good enough, she was wanted, she was home. The woman in the wedding dress had found her place at last, and it turned out that place had been waiting for her all along, here at Cedar Hollow, where broken people could heal and love could bloom again in the most unexpected of hearts.